Good evening, everybody. Shortly, we will be going live for our meeting tonight, Coronavirus and Housing Insecurity, What is to be Done. We'll be going live at 6 o'clock. So let us know where you're joining us from in the world. Share to any friends who might be interested. I'll see you at 6. Bye. Good evening, everyone. Please stay tuned. We will be starting this meeting at 6 o'clock British time, which is in about 7 minutes. So stay tuned. Give us a like, give us a comment, let us know where you're joining us from in the world. And yeah, we'll be starting shortly discussing coronavirus and housing insecurity.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's meeting organised by Nottingham Revolutionary Communist Group, Coronavirus and Housing Insecurity, What is to be done? So tonight we are going to answer the question, why is there so much homelessness, precarious, unfit accommodation in one of the world's richest countries? Why is the state of housing so atrocious for many, many members of the working class? And more importantly, what is to be done about this situation? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to. Sorry about that, technical problems as ever. So before we start, I will just start by saying if you like what you hear, you can support us by buying our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. You can buy that online. I'll post a link into the chat on both YouTube and Facebook momentarily once I've finished speaking. This paper is absolutely vital in the kind of circumstances we're in, where the most critical voice in the bourgeois media is somebody like Piers Morgan, and where it is absolutely vital that we can get a working class standpoint, a working class explanation of events, a socialist explanation of events, and a socialist call to action out into the media landscape. You can also support our organisation by donating directly. You can donate to our organisation as we continue to strive for the revolutionary change that the world needs. And I'll post that in the comments in a second as well. So the format tonight, we're going to hear from two speakers. We're going to hear from first Matt, and then we're going to hear from Scott. I'm not going to step on their toes. I'll let them introduce what they're going to say. After they've spoken, I will be taking questions and comments and feeding those into either answering questions or a discussion between what is effectively your digital panel tonight. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Matt, who's going to address the meeting first.
Cool, yeah. Thanks a lot for that. So, yes, I will be talking about our understanding of that housing crisis. So yeah, thanks for tuning in today, everybody. I'll be covering the measures to do with housing that have been put into place after the coronavirus pandemic and the roots of the housing crisis. As was just mentioned, if you've got any points or interjections or questions, let us know in the comments and we will discuss them. What I'm going to be saying is drawing very heavily from a pamphlet we released in 2018 called Whose Land Is It Anyway, which is available on our website now. I've also drawn a lot from our paper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which you can subscribe to using the links that will be shortly in the comments. I'm just going to post a link to Whose Land Is It Anyway now. So, what has the government announced with respect to housing and the coronavirus pandemic? So the big move really is that the Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick promised a ban on evictions. And what this is actually means in practice is that all renters are still liable for the total amount of the normal rent, but landlords might have to give renters an extra month notice before they can evict, depending on the tenancy type. So, this doesn't extend to lodgers. Lodgers are in exactly the same place they were before. As things stand, possession orders that were issued on March 26th will be active from June 25th. The government has allowed mortgage payment holidays for landlords with buy-to-let mortgages. However, there is no payment break or holiday for renters. Renters can only pause rent payments if their landlord agrees. The mortgage holiday may mean an increase in mortgage payments after the holiday ends, and 1 in 9 mortgage holders in the UK has taken one of these holidays. And all of this points to a massive increase in homelessness and precarious accommodation due to the current economic crisis, and that could be starting as soon as June. There's also been reports in the last few days of asylum seekers in Glasgow who have been moved out of the temporary accommodation they've been in, and they've been put into a hotel where social distancing is totally impossible in this hotel because the food is given communally. So disease is going to move through that very rapidly if anyone there gets sick. Overcrowded housing is it's a major contributor to the spread of diseases like COVID-19. But all of this is just adding to a long-standing existing housing crisis in Britain, which I will now go into, and I'll talk about the features of it and where those features come from. And the facts in this next section all talk about before the pandemic and the massive economic crisis we're facing now. Around 60,000 people are estimated to be living in blocks wrapped in aluminium composite materials, which is a sort of cladding. And the safety of this was demonstrated at Grenfell 3 years ago. Already, over 9,000 people a year die from poverty. According to Shelter, the number of homeless people in England last year was the highest since it began keeping records, at 280,000 people. Rough sleeping is up 165% since 2010. Around 5,000 people are sleeping rough on any night, and 135,000 children are homeless. And one child becomes homeless every 8 minutes. Number of households in temporary accommodation is up 77% compared to 2010. And Crisis, which is a housing charity, estimate that there are an additional 71,400 individuals, families sofa surfing on any given night. Shelter thinks that across England, 1 in every 200 people is without a home, and that rises to 1 in every 52 in London. There's an average of 5 homeless children for every classroom in England. The majority of homeless households, particularly those with children, are shunted into temporary accommodation that is largely not. In the first quarter of 2019, there were 84,740 households, with some 126,000 children housed temporarily. Temporary housing is the new slum accommodation. It's often overcrowded, cramped, and infested with vermin, racked with damp and mold, and there's often broken and dangerous furniture and fixtures. Much of these people are put into B&Bs, converted offices, and repurposed derelict buildings, even shipping containers in some cases. These figures are testimony to the searing individual human cost of the housing crisis. It's driven by austerity, the failure of housing benefits to cover soaring rents, landlords refusing to accept tenants on benefits, as well as delays in receiving benefits, particularly universal credit. A majority of NHS mental health care providers believe that universal credit has been the single biggest factor contributing to a rising mental health crisis in Britain. The current economic crash will see this hardship experienced by hundreds of thousands more. By the 26th of March, 500,000 people are new would-be claimants. They had attempted to register for universal credit, only to find themselves in a queue of thousands, unable to get through on any phone line or access any help whatsoever. So where does this housing crisis come from? How is it so broad and so deep? Overpopulation is not a cause of the housing crisis, and is not an overcrowded island, and arguments claiming that the population is too large to be accommodated are totally false. For every acre that is built on, 9 acres are not. There is roughly half a standard football pitch for each of the 62 million people living in Britain. 90% of people live in urban areas, and only 5% of the land area is urban. The very real shortages of transport, school places, medical care, and all the rest of the complaints of the daily life for working class people are shortages and underfunding of infrastructure. Population pressures exist precisely because services are rationed, not the other way around. Underlying the housing crisis is the fact that average house prices in Britain doubled between 2000 and 2018, which is an increase much faster than average earnings or population. So I'm now going to talk about why that's happened, why house prices are so high, why they've risen so much faster than the things you would expect to correlate with house prices. So to understand prices, Karl Marx, who was the founder of scientific socialism, explained how the prices of commodities are centered on the amount of socially necessary labor that goes into them. In general, if a car takes 1,000 times as much labor to produce as a sandwich, the car will cost 1,000 times as much. However, housing is fundamentally different to commodities like cars or sandwiches or what have you. The key difference with housing is that it uses up land. It is the massive increase in land prices that largely explains the increase in house prices. Land was never produced by any workers. It is a gift of nature, so to say. The price of land cannot be based on the labour that went into it. Instead, the price of a piece of land is based fundamentally on the prevailing rate of interest and the amount of rent it generates. Landlords can extract money from tenants for the right to use their land. The authority of the landlord to extract this money, rent, from the tenant is backed up by the power of the state. How high rent can go depends on the quality of the land. So for builders, which is our most pertinent example here, the quality of the land depends on its location. Land in the centre of London or Manchester or Glasgow is closer to workplaces, has better infrastructure and so on, so that can demand a higher rent. And landlords obviously always want rents to be as high as possible. But there are limits on this process. If a landlord raises rent beyond a certain point, then the farmer or the building developer or other forms of tenant will receive profits lower than average, and that will cause them to move their farming or their building to another landlord who charges a lower rent for comparable land. So the price of land is determined by the rent it can attract divided by the prevailing rate of interest. If you had a savings account holding £4,000 with an interest rate of 5%, you would get annual interest payments of £200. So totally equivalently, if you were a landlord and you earned rent of £200 a year and the prevailing interest was £5, your land would be valued at £4,000. So land prices and hence housing prices rise when rents go up, or land prices also rise when interest rates fall. Currently, interest rates are very, very low as a result of there being few profitable outlets for productive investment. The point is that the price of land, and therefore the price of housing, is tied in to these two fundamental aspects of the capitalist system, which is rent and interest rates. Any real sustainable solution to the housing crisis will have to totally upend this system, which is based in private property and land. And it's going to have to end the current system where landlords profit from empty housing and undeveloped land while hundreds of thousands are left homeless. So here in Britain, one of the, a key part of this is that the state subsidizes landlords regardless of how their land is used. This increases the rents that their lands can attract. What are known as farm subsidies are in fact landholding subsidies, so that landowners not only pay no tax on land, but they receive subsidies for the acres they hold. The source of subsidy has been both the Common Agricultural Policy, which is an EU policy, and the British taxpayer, and it amounts to between £3.5 billion and £5 billion every year. 90% of this subsidy goes to the top 10% of landowners. Around 1/3 of land in the so-called United Kingdom is still owned by aristocrats. So, for example, the Queen claimed £686,000 in these subsidies from Brussels in 2014, and that's only because of the Sandringham farms on her Norfolk estate. The British state, you'll be pleased to hear, is going to keep this subsidy going for the next few years now that Britain has left the European Union. Given the advantages of land ownership with guaranteed land subsidy and no tax liabilities, it is not surprising that land acts like a tax haven, a land bank. Major pension funds have invested in land over the years and now own 550,000 acres. They have been joined by a variety of multinational companies, usually very secretive, which also use land as a bank for future investment. Huge sums of money which are unable to find sufficient outlets for profitable investment are increasingly drawn into various forms of speculation, including purchasing of land. House builders buy and then sit on land with planning permission, but do not build in order to maximize their profits. 5 government reviews since 2004 claim that house builders do not use land banks speculatively. In 2017, the Local Government Association, which represents local councils, identified sites for 500,000 homes in England, which had been given planning permission, but where no building had taken place. So these claims from governments, Labour coalition and Conservative governments, that house builders do not use land banks is just a total lie, basically. Plots are held on average for around 6 years before building begins. The British housing industry has proved to be a profitable outlet for surplus funds from around the world. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager and the world's largest shadow bank, is a major shareholder in the estate agent Savills and in Britain's largest supplier to the construction industry, Travis Perkins. It's also a major shareholder in all of the big four house building companies. It controls $6 trillion worth of assets. So behind the British housing system, which leaves so many in squalor or on the streets, lie the vested interests of property developers, construction companies, financial monopolies, and the City of London. So hopefully what I've just said has explained why inadequate housing and homelessness are so prevalent in such a rich country. Housing prices are pushed up both by government policy designed to benefit landlords and by the mechanics of global capitalism. Speculation in land gives a very profitable way of owning land, even when it's not used to house the hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless. I'm now going to round up by making some points about housing in Britain and what we can expect in the coming period. So in Britain, roughly 70% live in owner-occupied housing. And this has been possible because, in the face of constant inter-imperialist rivalries, the British ruling class sought to bind the middle class and better off sections of the working class materially and politically to the imperialist interests of the ruling class by encouraging the acquisition of a stake in capitalist society in the form of home ownership. That this proved possible was due to a number of factors, which varied over time, but depended crucially on the continuation of Britain's ability to live from plunderous colonies, and from the 50s onwards, the formerly independent, less developed nations. The stable jobs which are needed for workers to become owner-occupiers are becoming a fantasy for wider and wider sections of the working class. These stable jobs presuppose a stable and expanding capitalism. Some 1.6 million households have only been able to afford a mortgage by taking out what's called an interest-only mortgage, meaning the entire principal has to be paid back at the end of the mortgage term. 1.3 million of households with that sort of mortgage have made no provision for paying back that principal, which is, that stores massive problems for the financial system coming up. The US subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 showed what happens when a whole section of borrowers cannot pay back their debts. A mass program of housing building would reverse the trend of the last 40 years, where Conservative and Labour governments have consistently been working to undermine social housing. We have to understand, though, how capitalism finances social housing. It is very different economically from owner-occupied housing or private renting. From the perspective of the employer, cheap housing is a good thing because it reduces the wages that capitalists have to pay workers, but it also brings problems. Council housing represents competition with private landlords, limiting the level of private rents. It undermines the development process. The council replaces the developer, the financier, and even the builder, threatening their respective profits. Council housing does not help capitalism make profits. It is a cost, a drain on total profits, and was only ever a temporary concession by capitalism in the exceptional conditions following the Second World War. We can see that's the case due to the, the massive attacks that council housing and social housing has been under in the recent decades. It's been deliberately run down. Between 2010 and now, government policy has been aimed at removing the historic responsibility of local councils to provide housing and facilitate the potential for capitalism to extract vast profits from rising land prices. In this, the coalition and Conservative governments are aided and abetted by Labour local authorities across the country, without whose willing collusion and capitalisation of social housing would have been much harder. The result is that while in 1979, 42% of the population lived in social housing, today the figure is less than 7%. The deliberate destruction of social housing has forced growing sections of the working class into the private rented sector. In Nottingham, the waiting list for council houses is 9,000 households long, massively outstripping the planned new builds. So households on that waiting list are inevitably going to be forced into the private rented sector if they can afford it, or if not, temporary accommodation or another form of homelessness. Rents in the private rental sector have been rapidly outstripping earnings. Between 2000 and 2010, private rents rose by 80%. However, this massive increase in cost to tenants has not caused an increase in quality. The number of people in the private sector has doubled to 38% from 2010 to 2018. Overcrowding, vermin, damp, and cold are all rife, along with harassment, theft, and negligence. Nearly a third of all private rental properties fall below the government's decent homes minimum standard. Neglect by unscrupulous landlords has created 740,000 homes that are physically unsafe. Those affected include 510,000 children and 180,000 disabled people. So, what can we expect in the coming weeks and months? Following the 2008 crash and the deepest financial crisis since the 1930s, the program of the program of transferring public property to the private sector became more urgent for the class. While banks were bailed out to the tune of some £850 billion, the mouthpieces of the ruling class in Parliament and the media blamed the crisis on state welfare spending. In 2010, the Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling said he would prepare the most swingeing cuts in public expenditure in a generation. Figures from the Chartered Institute of Housing show that for right to buy, demolition and privatisation, 230,000 social homes were lost in just the last 8 years. As the British economy faces an even bigger crisis than 2008, we will surely see a huge tide of people who are financially ruined, totally unable to pay mortgages or rents. The British state will do everything in its power to force the working class to pay for this economic crisis and stifle the inevitable demands for decent housing for all. A new kind of movement has to be built that understands that the struggle for decent housing is part of the struggle against the class rule, those who profit from the land and exploitation of workers, that the demand for housing cannot be separated from the fight against insecurity, hunger, cuts, and services. Now we will be hearing shortly from Scott, who will be talking about some lessons from history for that movement. And I will quickly point out one thing that I failed to show earlier before I hand back over to our chair, and that is that you should be able to see the image of that the thing I mentioned earlier, the housing pamphlet that should be on the screen now. So that's available from our website. And with that, I will hand over to our chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. I just was wondering, would you mind repeating your last paragraph? There were a couple of technical problems. Your voice went quite sort of robot-y for a second there. If you wouldn't mind just sort of repeating the conclusion, because I think it was probably quite important, and then we'll pass over to Scott.
Sure, thank you for raising that. Okay. Yes, excuse me, I got a bit dry then. Okay. As the British economy faces a crisis even bigger than 2008, we will surely see a huge tide of people who are financially ruined, totally unable to pay mortgages or rents. The British state will do everything in its power to force the working class to pay for this economic crisis and stifle the inevitable demands for decent housing for all. A new kind of movement has to be built that understands that the struggle for decent housing is part of the struggle against the class rule of those who profit from the land and from the exploitation of workers. The movement has to understand that the demand for housing cannot be separated from the fight against insecurity, cuts, and failing services.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Matt. So hopefully our listeners at home, our viewers, listeners, whichever it is, found Matt's presentation useful. We're now going to pass over to Scott, who's going to talk a little bit more about examples of exactly that kind of movement that Matt was talking about, both from British history and from the looking internationally about the kind of resistance to the housing crisis and the kind of fight for decent housing conditions for the working class that the world has seen, is seeing, and will see again. So I'll pass over to Scott.
Hello. So far we've heard the cause and the impact of the housing crisis in Britain, and so far this would seem pessimistic. Now we'll be looking at historic and contemporary examples of mass working class resistance. In the first example, we will look at the Glasgow rent strikes. So this takes us back to the First World War in 1915. So while men and boys were off fighting in the fields of Flanders, the wives, sisters, and mothers were watching things back home. And the also patriotic landlords of Glasgow implemented a series of rent increases, while the soldiers were still away, and evictions against tenants. With thousands of workers flooding into the cities, workshops and shipyards for war production, a lot of women worked in the munition factories. And at the time, they were main breadwinners. At this time, rent payment was something that the wife sorted out in the household. After realising that this was unfair, the landlords had demanded rent increases for substandard housing, and it started with a handful of women refusing to pay rent. At first, the increase and then the rent until the amount demanded returned to more normal. Most of these women and their families lived in tenement buildings and organised that they would meet every morning in the communal backyard of these buildings. And they had a system in place, and the children became involved. Basically, Baileys were recognisable because they wore bowler hats. And if spotted by the children, they would run in and tell their mothers, who would rattle wooden spoons and pans to signal that the neighbours meet in the backyard. And once they knew whose address was to be targeted, they would barricade. And sometimes they would even bring eggs and flour to send off the unwanted guests. So these women had organised themselves and arranged meetings in their communal back gardens every morning while circulating rolls of speaker and chair and someone to record decisions. And it would be collectively agreed that the landlords asking for increased rent while the war was on was a cowardly act. And the bailiffs carrying out these evictions were bullies. It was only after a dozen or so evictions happened that they started to fight back. So everywhere, mass demonstrations, local meetings, and factories assemblies were taking up with questions of rent, conscription to workplace controls, and the terrible slaughter of war proceeded. What had begun as localised dispute over rent increases in the autumn of 1915 became transformed into a genuine threat to the British state. Glasgow had the most important centre of war production in the empire. The example provided by the rent campaign had spread unrest and organisation into every industrial district of the city and threatened to disrupt the flow of munitions into the armies in the Western Front. Almost 30,000 families were now refusing to pay rent. And the growth of state repression in the factories alongside the continuous harassment of tenants forged the previously desperate struggles over housing and working conditions closer together. The month of October saw 20,000 people in Govan and Partick mobilised to defend the threatened house of right strike leader Andrew Hood. The British government was now forced to act. Munitions Minister Lloyd George dispatched official representatives to investigate the rents question and continuing threats of unofficial action over 3 jailed shipwrights. They left Scotland having failed to resolve either, and on the 17th of November, the Glasgow landlords launched one final attempt to reassert their power amidst the rumours of government interventions on controlled rents. 18 workers appeared in court, faced with eviction warrants and recovery of rent arrears in the small debts courts. The court ceased the occasion for the festival of working class resistance and solidarity. Once the greatest demonstration in Glasgow's history, workers from at least 5 shipyards, 1 munitions factory, and Albion Motors worker were down tools and joined the demonstration in the front court. This was the birth of working class power. Workers' dispute determined a private audience with the judge dedicated to the terms of peace. War production on the Clyde would be brought to a halt immediately if the case was not resolved favourably. The ruling class acted swiftly. A terrified Sheriff Lee postponed Lloyd George, who instructed him to drop the case. By early December 1915, Parliament rushed through a Rent Restriction Act controlling rents to pre-war levels and for the duration of the war and beyond. A famous victory had been won. Now, this is a key example of organised mass struggle and brings together different sections of the working class, enforcing the capitalist state to give large concessions to the workers. The final example we'll talk about here is in current day Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is still a capitalist country. However, a socialist government got into power through, the electoral process. The final example, right? So, the socialist government had built more than 3 million homes for working class people over the last 10 years, and in repairing, upgraded millions more. In response to the COVID-19, the Venezuelan government had announced that all rent payments and interest payments had to be suspended for 6 months. Compare this to the British state, which hasn't issued any rent freezes at all. This is the result of a revolutionary movement in Venezuela that demands basic rights for all. But to achieve this and other basic rights, the progressive movement sabotaged support by imperialist interests in the United States and Britain, economic warfare, and the murder of land rights activists at the behest of wealthy landowners. No central control or local government project will solve the housing crisis and for the working class. What Glasgow rent strikes and the housing missions in Venezuela show is that the working class itself, through campaigning, through solidarity, and through resistance on the streets and communities, will be able to change the power of the landowners. Landlords, builders, developers, corporations, and the political allies, only movements that represent the mass working class and aren't constrained by law or respectability to the ruling class, are able to achieve decent housing for all. So both these movements could only happen through mass mobilizations. it's people getting behind a party. It's not just enough to say, that political party has this manifesto, this agenda. They're unable to achieve these things unless people support them, get out in the streets, and that is how we're going to do it today. The same as we did, over a century ago, and the same the way that Venezuela has done it now. So we'll just go back to our chair now.
Thank you very much, Scott. For two very inspiring examples that I hope that are already starting to get some responses on the comments. So I'll remind everybody, there are links posted. I'll post them again shortly about where you can get a subscription or buy an individual PDF copy of our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, where all these kinds of issues and analysis are covered. And I'll post a link as well to where you can donate to our organisation so that we can continue trying to build the kind of political organisation that can take part in those movements that Scott and Matt have both spoken about. So I'll go to the comments. We've had a lot of comments, so I'll sort of pick out, I'll go through them and pick out ones that I think would be useful for us to discuss. We've had a comment from Jake, who, referring back maybe about 20 minutes ago to where Matt was talking, was agreeing, I think, with what Matt was saying, that overpopulation is a myth, saying that we have more empty houses than homeless people. And Jake tells a story about his own experiences. He says, we had a lump of land given to the town for the workers who died in the pit mines below. And they then sold it to an American company that folded up dodgily cheap houses and are selling them for £300,000 to £500,000. And Jake says he's living in one of the very few social housing blocks in the area that are so dangerously cheap, as the bourgeoisie aren't happy with being forced to lose profits on social housing, that if it was any taller, it'd fucking fall down, is the quote. So yeah, thanks for that, Jake. Jake also said something that I wondered what the two speakers thought about this. I think it's an interesting argument, possibly different, possibly in agreement with what Matt was saying. Jake says we don't need to build more houses. We need to force the bourgeoisie to house the homeless in the empty houses all across the private housing market. So I wondered if, well, either of you, but probably particularly Matt, wanted to come back on that point.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, and it's factually true that I know certainly in Britain and the United States, the available but unoccupied housing vastly outstrips the homeless population. I'm not sure how true that is on a global scale, but it's certainly true in the imperialist countries. So, I don't think it's about either and or. I think hopefully what I was talking about demonstrates that it's fundamentally the private ownership of land that is the main, is the fundamental reason why you can have empty homes and homeless people. So I think, yeah, if you can break that by breaking the landlord's ability to keep people who need houses out of the houses they own, then that is to some extent solving the problem. But so yeah, I mean, basically, I think I agree with what Jake's saying. But it's also, there's different forms of demands. So it is correct to support demands that improve the lives of working class people, even if in themselves they don't destroy the capitalist system, and that's how movements grow and gain strength. So if a movement is demanding more housing, then that should also be supported. So I don't think it's an either or.
Thank you for that, Matt. We've had a few questions on similar topics, actually, or on a similar topic. So I'm going to kind of take all those now. And the kind of unifying topic is about racism. So I've got three comments. Three comments or questions asking about housing. So Lee, I think it was, said, I think, this is Despeen says, I think something really important to talk about is the racialized division of housing, in that the worst class of housing is primarily forced on immigrants and people of colour in Britain, which has itself exacerbated the current pandemic. Is I think a very important comment that I hope our speakers can come back on. And Lee has said two things that correspond to that quite well. Lee says that when it comes to housing, a lot of British propaganda really tries to convince the working class that it's migrants that are causing the housing crisis instead of the state and instead of capitalism. And Lee also says that it might be interesting to look at migrant housing, both official and unofficial, because the conditions are often quite horrendous. And maybe our speakers could talk, if they know anything about it, about the situation facing migrants already in those conditions in the face of this pandemic. So yeah, I wondered if our speakers had anything to say on that.
I'll jump in there before Scott, if that's okay, Scott. So yeah, I think it's as I can't remember who you said from the comments pointed out, but yeah, it's definitely true that racialized people are forced into the worst sections of the private rented accommodation. And if you I don't recall the statistics off the top of my head, but if you look at the statistics of overcrowding accommodation for people of Bangladeshi descent compared to white British people, it's much a higher prevalence of overcrowding, particularly for Bangladeshi people. And that follows across the board for all sorts of racialized people in Britain. So I'm not an epidemiologist, but that must have some relationship to the massively higher incidences of fatalities that we are seeing from COVID-19 amongst racialized people in Britain. And yeah, with respect to the official and unofficial migrant housing, it's important to bear in mind that asylum seekers in Britain they're not allowed to work. They're totally cut off and split out of the rest of the working class, and they're forced to live off state aid that's totally insufficient to live on. And I'm reminded particularly of the work of an organisation called SIMAG, which stands for South Yorkshire Migration. There's two A's and a G. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on
And Asylum Action Group, I believe.
And Asylum Action Group, thank you. And they've done a lot of work telling people about the horrendous temporary accommodation that asylum seekers are forced to live in. And as I mentioned, that's the thing that happens all over the country. And as we heard, as I mentioned at the start, horribly in Glasgow, asylum seekers have been forced out of the temporary accommodation that they were in into hotels, which are going to be, that it's another level of negligence under the pandemic conditions.
Scott, did you have anything to say on the subject, racism and housing and the pandemic?
I would just actually like to point out the myth of overpopulation. Britain is no different from other countries in that there's an overpopulation in the inner cities. One of the things of Scotland in particular is the fact that a lot of the land is just privately owned land that's sitting there doing nothing, but no one can actually build anything on it. There's like national parks. I mean, sure, it's nice to save wildlife, but people like need housing as well, and also remembering the current United States president complaining from a golf course that he owns about these wind turbines that were gaining natural energy from wind power were an eyesore. So hang on a minute. For this land that you've got for playing golf, could we not be building houses for the homeless on this land. It's going back to the whole George Carling, and golf is an elitist game. And on the subject of racism and housing, it's it was terrible before leaving Glasgow, hearing the stories of the private security firm Serco, who no doubt carried out these evictions of the asylum seekers in Glasgow. Now, Serco is a security firm. Now, why on earth would they be put in charge of housing people? And they were hearing some of the stories from the communities of asylum seekers, like young mothers, young women with children. Now, 7 o'clock in the morning, they're just getting out of a shower, and they find a strange man in their house, and it's a Serco worker who has keys to the property, just lets himself in, and starts walking around the place as if they own it. That's dehumanizing to anyone, let alone someone that's have to come from Syria or whatever background, whatever war that they've had to flee, that to finally arrive in this place and going through now the people that are going through the asylum process, you could be claiming asylum and you could be waiting for a hearing to come up as to whether you're granted or not. It's people that are in that position that are put in this precarious housing. And in the meantime, you're banned from working. You could be eager to work. You could, get yourself just a job in a newsagent, or a job fruit picking, or a job as a cleaner, but you're not allowed to have an income while you're waiting on, this status.
Yeah,
Hopefully
absolutely.
that answered.
Yeah, and I think the point that whichever one of our commenters it was made, I can't now see who that was, about the role of the kind of racist propaganda in trying to convince people that the problems the problems facing working class people are the fault of the kind of people that Scott is talking about, or using racism in that way. And that's why we've always put the fight against racism as absolutely central to any chance of socialist politics anywhere in the world, but particularly in an imperialist country, because you can see where failing to put that at the center of the political struggle can lead. And our listeners, watchers, whatever the right word is, might be interested, if they haven't come across it before, to read some of our material on our website about racism and imperialism. But there's a very interesting letter that Karl Marx wrote in 1870. You can search Marx to Siegfried Mayer and August Vogt in New York, that's Bogt, where he talks about the deliberate use of racism to divide the working class, and how that is the source of the weakness of the working class movement. And we obviously are in a situation where that racist agenda is going to be pushed even further to distract the attention of so-called British working class people away from the real culprits in the crisis that we're facing. So I have a few more blocks of questions. So Anime asks, I would also like to hear more about subsidies for landowners. It's mind-blowing how much they get for just being parasites. And I'd never read about this until I got the Whose Land Is It Anyway pamphlet. And I'll couple that up with another question from Anime as well. Could you talk more about Focus E15 or the Nottingham Housing Justice Forum? I know FRFI has supported both campaigns for decent housing for all. What can we learn from this experience? I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
I can talk a bit about the land subsidies and the NHJF, and Scott can talk about Focus E15 if that sounds good. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not super well versed on the land subsidies. I'm in a similar boat to our commentator. I wasn't really aware of them until I read our pamphlet, Whose Land Is It Anyway? But I think an important thing to bear in mind is that they were introduced during the course of the Second World War, and they were actually made permanent by the 1945 Labour government, which is so often touted by sections of the left in Britain as being, that's what socialism is, that's the British road to socialism, to try and ape the path of that government under Clement Attlee, when actually, with respect to the land issue, it directed huge portions of public funds into the pockets of these aristocrats. And they're doing that not because Clement Attlee is a nice man or a horrible man, doing that to secure the stable continuation of land ownership in Britain. They're doing it to keep this taking over in a more suitable form. And that's the role that that Labour government played in all sorts of states. That's a similar reason for why they waged such brutal war on the people Britain was colonising at the time. And it's also worth making a similar realization about the role of the European Union, that also made these similar sorts of these similar subsidies, because whose interests is the EU for? It's for the interests of the propertied and ruling classes across Europe. What was the other thing? Yes, so the Nottingham Housing Justice Forum. It was a apologies. Before we started talking, we were meant to be hearing an interview about the Nottingham Housing Justice Forum, and we've messed that up for technical reasons. But if you want to listen to that, it's still on SoundCloud. If you just search Nottingham Housing Justice, I'm sure you'll find it. And what that was, it was a campaign that we were part of, and it was really sort of telling the lie to the council's propaganda around housing. So you can read about the particular ins and outs of the struggle on the Nottingham Housing Justice Forum blog, but basically the Nottingham City Council, as with councils up and down the country, their main line is we're getting our funding cut and there's nothing we can do about it, which is half true. They are getting their funding cut, but the position of the RCG and the position of the Nottingham Housing Justice Forum was always that the councillors need to actually resist if they have any claim to defend the rights of their constituents. It's not acceptable to just say, oh, well, the Chancellor says we have to destroy the quality of lives of our constituents, so we have to do it. And I think that's a really important lesson that we can take from the Nottingham Housing Justice Forum. And if anyone around Nottingham is interested in, keeping that struggle up, please get in touch and let us know.
Scott, did you want to come in on answer the question about the Focus E15 campaign?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that it was a campaign. The campaign had already started, and these young women were trying to collect petitions in the Stratford area, and they happened to bump into comrades of ours, and like the East London branch, who gave them, like more advice. Just a quick brief on the history of what happened there. Now, as part of the build up to the Olympic Games in London, they tried this thing called gentrification. They did the same thing in Glasgow with the Commonwealth Games. They take the poorest parts of the city, traditionally the East End, because when you go back to industrial times, the wind would blow the smoke to the East End of the city. But these sort of poorer areas in the city, they try and clean them up, make them more affluent, more attractive for outsiders. And what they'd actually done, now the Focus E15 was actually a hostel in the E15 postcode in London. That was it was like a refuge for young mothers, or mothers to be, like pregnant women who were kicked out the house or fleeing an abusive partner. It was somewhere for them to go and sort of feel safe. Now, as part of the gentrification after, and in the build up to the 2012 Olympic Games and after, in September, the mayor of Newham, whose constituent this was part of, he was a Labour Party member, and he was the one that actually Robin Wells closed this centre. So these young women, when they were told by other left campaigns, "Oh yeah, don't worry, Labour will sort it out," they knew firsthand it was a Labour councillor who closed the hostel. How on earth were they going to help them? Now, one of the things that they did not long after the closure of the centre was they took something called the Carpenter's Estate, which was these sort of like tower blocks that were done up, and then they were modernised, they were cleaned up, and they were expecting that after the Olympic Games that a lot of people outside of London, or people more affluent in London, were going to move into them. But the stigma was still attached. No one wants to live, in that part of town, or at least they didn't then. So they took this empty tower block and they managed to occupy it for a couple of months, actually setting up, what like a youth centre. They had this occupation where they had parties, they had banners hanging out the windows, saying like "homes for homeless," and they used it. They used an empty building. Now that's the thing with the myth that there are more, with the myth that there's not enough houses, or there's too many homeless people. There's actually more empty houses than there are homeless people. And they proved it by actually going in. Now, some of these young women had been born and raised in the London area, and their family and their social networks were in that area, but they were told, there's no housing for you here. So they were having to be told to move to like Hastings or even up to Manchester, because they were told that there was no housing for them in London. And they proved it wrong by occupying a place that was previously council housing, that's something that we no longer have. We have housing associations, but they took an empty council building and occupied it. And I think the building's still empty to this day.
Thank you very much, Scott. I just wanted to pick up on something that Matt said. So Matt mentioned about some of the myths about the 1945 to 51 Labour government. If our viewers haven't come across it before, we have a book on this very subject that I will post a link to shortly, called Labour, a Party Fit for Imperialism. And in the meantime, the meeting that we held something like last week addressed exactly this question. And if you go to, you're already on either Facebook or YouTube, so just look at our previous videos and you'll see probably the one before this, where we held a meeting discussing exactly these questions, and you can watch the video back. So I now have a sort of series of questions about socialism and movements for socialism. So I'll read some of those out and then invite the speakers to come back. Lee says it's worth chatting a bit about the discussion about housing in socialist countries or communities fighting for socialism, such as Venezuela, Cuba, the Soviet Union. Heidi says any argument that homelessness in Britain is unavoidable or necessary is totally blown out of the water by the reality that socialist Cuba, a country under economic blockade by the richest country in the world, has universal housing. And Heidi also says, with reference to Venezuela, that as a country targeted and attacked by imperialism, the idea that the Venezuelan government and the idea, a country targeted and attacked by imperialism, the idea that the Venezuelan government and the efforts of the Bolivarian Revolution and all of its community activists, which never get mentioned in the media, the idea that they are failing to provide for the people of Venezuela, the idea that there's poverty, the poverty is created by the move by Venezuela, by the socialist government of Venezuela itself, and not by the crushing blockade, has really been shown to be false by the inspiring response of the socialist movement in Venezuela to COVID-19. And Heidi says that an article in the current issue of FRFI writes about how rent has been suspended, layoffs suspended for a year, food boxes delivered to 7 million families. And Heidi points out that this is not happening in imperialist Britain, where instead the priorities of making a profit are prioritized. So those comments about socialism I thought were definitely worth exploring, and I'd like to invite our speakers to come back.
I'll jump in. Yeah, so I think it is really the issue of housing really demonstrates what we mean by the difference between capitalism and socialism. So, if you take the example of the Soviet Union, there were issues in housing in the Soviet Union. They had issues of overcrowding, but they didn't have something that you can only really have in a capitalist society, which is vast empty homes and homeless people. I was reading on our website that recently in London they had sold a house for like £2 million, and it has a vitality pool which is covered in gold. Yeah, so in London they're selling houses covered in gold while people are dying from exposure on the streets. And something like this is totally unthinkable in the Soviet Union, totally unthinkable in Cuba. And another interesting thing, which might be different to, if people aren't very familiar with these societies, um, quite something you might not expect is that in Cuba, a lot of the housing is sort of privately owned, not privately owned as in I'm a buy-to-let landlord and you can live in the house I own and you can pay my mortgage for me. Thank you very much. Privately owned as in people, own their own houses. And I think that's a very interesting way that those things have developed. If you look at which countries have the highest amount of people actually owning their own houses, rather than having to, pay someone for their entire lives, or rather than be exploited just to have the pleasure of living in a house, all the highest rates of owner occupation are socialist or some former socialist countries, places like the former Soviet Union, places like Cuba, places like Romania. And that's because they eliminated this social layer of landlords who live off parasitism. And, tragically, that layer is reintroducing itself in the former socialist areas of Europe.
I'm just thinking, remember in Cuba, like rents are capped. It's got to be less than a third of someone's, monthly salary. It's the rents are actually controlled and capped, because again, it's like where does rent go to when if you rent a house, or if you rent any property? Where does that money actually go to, and what exactly are you paying for? And whereas in the UK we've got, like, crazy things like, the difference between freehold and leasehold. It's things that's actually covered in the housing pamphlet. But it's like you could own your house, but you don't own the land that's underneath it here. So if you happen to dig in your backyard and you find, like some rare mineral, whatever, it's actually owned by the council or whoever the real landowners are. You're not entitled to it. You're entitled to what's built above the ground, but not, the land itself. But where does this money go to? But the fact that in Cuba there's a conscious effort to actually control rents and say, let's make them affordable. If your monthly salary is X, then you shouldn't be spending any more than a quarter or a third of your monthly salary on living, on rent. But the only way to do that is through planning and state control. Something that, again,
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's worth saying as well that I can't remember the exact figures, but after a certain number of years, housing is transferred into the ownership of the rent payer, where rents, of course, are paid to the state, as Matt mentions, not to private landlords. We've had a few comments about housing in Cuba that I think are worth referring the speakers to. So let me just find it. Annie says that in response to Heidi's original comment, says there are massive problems with housing in Cuba, though. But I've seen firsthand how this has been impacted by the blockade, and no one need be on the streets, which is not true in any capitalist former colony. So these issues about very real housing problems that do exist in Cuba are certainly worth highlighting. In order to really paint a picture of the lengths that imperialism is going to try to destroy the Cuban Revolution. And I hope our speakers might be able to come back on that. Despine has also said that with reference to Cuban housing, the Cuban Revolution really demonstrates the benefits of socialism through their commitment to building houses better when they've been hit by seasonal hurricanes, which was something that happened recently. When I was in Cuba about a year ago, it had just been hurricane, I think it must have been Irma, but I can't remember now. I always forget the names of the hurricanes. That had been sort of 2 months before. And even in the face of the real problem getting building materials that the Cuban Revolution faces, by sort of 2 months later, when we arrived in Cuba, they'd already rebuilt something like 80% of the housing that had been destroyed. And a lot of this rebuilding, we went to a building site where some of the housing was being rebuilt, and it was a community effort organized by the local institutions of popular power, the local Committee for the Defence of the Revolution, I believe it was. I believe Scott referred to something along the lines of that conscious political mobilization and a conscious understanding that housing is exactly the kind of thing, housing for the people is exactly the kind of priority that a socialist country should have and that people should have. So I don't know if either of our speakers want to add anything to what I've said or talk anything else about these issues that have been raised about housing and Cuban socialism.
I can mention, you mentioned the committees for the defence of the revolution, just to give people, a little background upon that. You went to Cuba last year. I was fortunate enough to go 5 years ago. We've been sending brigades over to through rock around the blockade to bring material aid past the United States blockade. The reason for the name for the campaign is the 1st Brigade that went over took over much needed sound equipment, like a PA system. And when I was there, we got to visit one of these CDRs, and it's kind of like the equivalent in this country would be like your bourgeois neighborhood. But whereas neighbourhood watch in this country is just like there's something worth stealing in this neighbourhood, and we want to look out for anyone that doesn't belong wandering or playing around the streets. Over there, it actually meant, a community, neighbourhood. You ask people, are your neighbours your friends? And they would say, no, they're more like family. And when they explained that, we've got to ask ourselves, what does the word community, what does it mean? Now, unlike here where you've got a doctor, so if you're in a working class neighbourhood and you visit your GP, your doctor's likely to be from out of town. And the same with the schools, the poorer inner city schools, the teachers are commuting from more affluent neighbourhoods to go into there. Whereas in Cuba, the neighbourhood is the community. To actually know that your doctor is only no more than a 5-minute walk away, to know that your kids are in the school is in the same neighbourhood that they live in, the teacher lives a few doors away or at least 5 minutes away. They have that strong sense of community that, if there was an issue like someone being bullied at school, then everyone knows everyone, but not in a bad way. Like what you're doing, etc. Everyone's a gossip. No, but if there's an issue, so what would that mean in reality? Now, imagine you've got an elderly neighbour. Now, compare that to sort of living in, in the middle of England, where if there was an elderly neighbour, if they don't get on with their other neighbour, don't know any, that person was to fall or something was to happen to them, it could be weeks before someone found out. Whereas if you know all your neighbours, someone would actually get up. Someone's checking in on you every day, and it's like, no, this person lives by themselves. I want to go and see that they're okay because they're my neighbour, because they're part of our community. I want to make sure that they're still alive, and bring them in food and say, where are your family? Why didn't I have, why is no one here to visit you? And that's what they meant when they said that they're not just neighbours, they're friends. And that's what the CDR is defending. The other thing with the CDR is a literal defence, is this is an armed neighbourhood. Now, when you get people saying, well, especially in the United States, they've got crazy gun laws. They'll say, what the Cuban people need to do? They need to arm themselves and overthrow the government. They are armed, but they don't want to overthrow the government because they are the government. They're part of the decision-making process. They're part of the state apparatus. They're part of the decision-making. And even if there was, an overthrow from above, these communities themselves will not go quietly into the night. That's all I have
Thank
to
you,
say.
Scott. Very, as Heidi says on the Facebook feed, very important intervention. And when you were speaking, it got me thinking about two things actually. Just the massive contrast between what you're talking about in Cuba, where people look out for each other because that's part of the social fabric, and the situation that we have in Britain, where before the pandemic, most of the charities like AIDS UK and so on estimated that about 1.5 million older people were essentially being abandoned in their homes without care packages that they need. It's a sign of a very sick society, also known as a capitalist society, that something like that can happen. And that just, Cuba shows that will not be allowed to happen. And it also reminded me of, to bring things back to the coronavirus a little bit. I was reading an interview earlier with Ana Marin, who's a Venezuelan communal activist, who was explaining that not just the Venezuelan government's, quite incredible response to the pandemic, which means that Venezuela probably has the lowest coronavirus mortality rate in all of Latin America, according to bourgeois estimates. But also the role that the socialist movement, based in the kind of community, to use Scott's words, is playing. And she was saying about how in where she is in El Panel, they have what she calls a social clan. So the local commune, the equivalent of the CDR in Cuba that Scott was talking about, has a plan of who has what needs in the community, and they're organizing and mobilizing people to meet those needs. And if you read the interview, I'll post a link to it. She talks very clearly about how this is connected to the struggle for socialism in Venezuela on all fronts. So I thought that was quite important to refer to. Before we move on to some other things, we had an interesting comment from Jake earlier on, quite a lot earlier on, that I thought was worth returning to. And Jake said that since the illegal dissolution of the USSR, it seems the social democratic reforms of the Cold War have been repealed over time. As the need to buy off the working class from revolution was much less necessary, as the bastion of the international revolution had collapsed, and as a result, the bourgeoisie had free rein to propagate against Marxism, Leninism, and shun socialism as something that doesn't work. This seems to have given them free rein to repeal the concessions. In order to repeal the concessions of the Cold War that had been used to silence the British proletariat. So I think that's quite an important historical point that tallies with certainly some of the material in the housing pamphlet. So I'd like to invite our speakers to come back on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important point, and like everything, there's two sides to it. So in the following the Second World War, you had two related phenomena. You had the post-war boom, where capitalism was able to massively expand, largely due to the devastation brought from the war, the massive, destruction of the organization of the working class in many countries, and increasing extraction of surplus into the neo-colonial settlement, where you saw the destruction of the formal empires, but you still had massive extraction of profits from the underdeveloped world. So you had that on the purely economic side, and on the political side, as Jake said, you also saw the massive esteem, the global esteem in the Soviet Union, following the historic role they played, taking on the lion's share of the army of Nazi Germany. So yes, not just talk about the Marshall Plan exploitation of the destroyed European markets. Yeah, indeed. So yeah, it's two sides. The ruling classes of Western Europe had both the means and the incentive to give a large section of the Western European population a stake, not only in an ideological stake in saying capitalism is the way forward. And it was actually those sections, like your sort of intelligentsia sections, that were vital in destroying socialism in the Soviet Union itself, because there were sections in the Soviet Union who thought, oh, my peers in the West, sort of academic types, intellectual types, a lot of them were thinking, my peers in the left have a better deal than I do, because they were getting more, a bigger slice of the pie in the West. And it was actually those sections in the Soviet Union who actually did quite well out of the destruction of socialism. And it was the working classes who bore the brunt of the destruction of socialism. It was the working classes who suffered the massive increases in suicides and deaths, and it was one of the highest rates in mortality ever outside of a war that's been seen in all of human history, with the destruction of the Soviet Union. And it was the working classes that faced that, and it wasn't these intellectuals. And that just shows you how central it is to world history, this role in increasing privileges to a substantial section in the imperialist countries. So yes, it's a very important point, and hopefully that makes it a bit clearer.
Just like to say, so capitalist imperialist logic is, they spend decades trying to chop down a tree, and then when it falls, to say, oh, it was going to fall anyway. The USSR, right from its inception, right from the Bolshevik Revolution to the Russian Civil War to basically straight after World War One, all these countries that then tried to go to war with the fledgling USSR and blockaded it and occupied it. They do this and then they say, oh, but it was going to fall anyway, it would not work. If you really thought that something was going to work, you would just let it collapse. It's like, if you keep going that, no, never mind. Just you'll learn from your own mistakes. But the fact that they insist on doing that, I mean, it's why that is these things are a threat. Socialism is a threat. They invested millions in this propaganda, and to some extent, it's effective. People before being involved in the group, I would have believed it as well. And there's things that you've got to ask yourself. As mentioning this to someone earlier on today, like the Black Panther Party in the United States. Now, the Black Panther Party for self-defense, the first thing that they ever did was, to assert their Second Amendment right to basically bear arms to defend themselves against police harassment. But it wasn't that got them in the FBI's most wanted list. What got them in the most wanted list was the breakfast clubs that they set up. How dare they set up an alternative to state provision? How dare they set up an alternative way of living where they can actually look after and provide for themselves? That's when they became enemy number one. And the fact that Cuba is still on, like some terrorism list as far as, the United States is concerned, what are they doing? Sending doctors to underdeveloped countries that need it, sending doctors out to, sending doctors to, to Italy to help fight the coronavirus. In 2015, 2014, they sent doctors out to the Congo to fight against Ebola. And the fact was that when the Soviet Union was overthrown, when it was bribed and it was corrupted to the point that it collapsed in itself, and they did a song and dance, of a victory. That's democracy. Sorry, that's the markets are opened up. That's democracy for them. That these markets that were previously locked off are now penetrated. They were expecting the same thing to happen in Cuba. Oh, they'll give up soon enough. But the Cuban people had more resistance. They still had that strong sense of community because they knew that if they were to give in, maybe a handful of the ringleaders would become fortunate. But who would they have to sell out to get there? They can see that if it wasn't for, their own policies protecting them, they've got Haiti next door to them. That's what it would be like. They've realised that they're not going to be like the United States. They've got to compare themselves to other, Latin American countries. But it takes this, mass movement. Yes, great leadership is one thing, but think of when Fidel came out in 92, 93, during what they called the special period, after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. He had to say to the people of Havana that during this time of austerity, and I'm talking real austerity, not 2008 Britain austerity, we lose 12% GDP. The GDP dropped 35% because 85% in international trade disappeared overnight. He had to say to the population that during this time, we're not going to close a single hospital or single, school or daycare centre or whatever. We'll spend more in social, and they did that. They opened more schools, they opened hospitals. But it was after the special period that ELAM, the Latin American School of Medicine, opened, and where they did cut, back in their spending was they had to pull troops out of South Africa. And as Nelson Mandela said when he got out of prison, when he was interviewed in some, American chat show, why on earth did he ever, ally himself or speak to the likes of Fidel Castro or Muammar Gaddafi? And he said to the host, to his face, those people supported us when we were facing the brutal armies of the apartheid South Africa. Where were you to help us? It's fine, to say that you're supporting us now, but they were the ones that were actually helping us. But that was one of the places where Cuba had to pull back. That they couldn't afford to keep soldiers in Angola. They had to bring them home. They brought them home, and they taught more people to become doctors. They taught, they had the Yes I Can. I can't remember the Spanish name, but this was a program to eradicate illiteracy. And they started sending these people into, underdeveloped countries to wipe out illiteracy. Whereas as Britain and the United States' role in developing countries has been absolutely disgusting. Yet, what can we say? The people that are making these decisions, did we choose them? Are they the representatives of us? No, we're stuck in this representative democracy, whereas over there they have direct participatory democracy. Something worth having here.
Thank you very much, Scott. Before we move on to probably our last few contributions and bits of discussion, I just wanted to come in with a couple of comments about some of what we've just heard from Matt and Scott in response to the questions about socialism. So we speak about Matt mentioned the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think it's always worth remembering that the ultimate blame for socialists, for progressive people in Britain, for the collapse of the socialist movement has to be put on the feet of the British left, the British socialist movement that refused to stand with the Soviet Union, with the Russian Revolution for the most part, basically, and did not fight for socialism and instead fought for the maintenance of a capitalist system. And that brings me on to a point I wanted to make about, we've talked about imperialism, but the central point that we have to remember, rather than thinking of, sometimes you can think that imperialism has, benefits the whole population in Britain or has bought off the whole population. That very clearly isn't true, for many of the reasons that Matt raised in his introduction. I think we have to be clear that the main thing we have to deal with is imperialism's political impact, that it creates a split within the working class movement. It means that you have a leadership within the working class movement that Marx, Engels, Lenin called a labor aristocracy, who are tied to imperialism and fight to ensure that the movement remains tied to imperialism. So I think those points are worth making, especially in the context where social housing is being destroyed, as Matt says. And what has the British left done about it? What have the trade unions done about it? What has the Labour Party done about it? I think the hands there from Matt and Scott sum it up about right. But it's an interesting question for us. The idea of a capitalist crisis has kind of come up, that, this is going to be, I believe Jake earlier used the phrase depression 2.0. But we've already been experiencing a major crisis for the last period. And, it's worth reflecting that buying off such a large section of the working class to direct socialist politics, working class politics into a reactionary pro-imperialist direction is becoming potentially more difficult. And this opens up possibilities for the struggle and for the movement. Because Lee, one of our commenters, Lee, made what I think is an important comment. Hopelessness is definitely our worst enemy, says Lee. We have to look at this and say, this crisis is being brought about by the imperialist system, but there is hope, and that hope is in a struggle for socialism. And it's always important to put that perspective. I wanted to move on now to something that one of our commenters on Facebook, Annie, said, referring back to the comments about the social plan in Venezuela that the communal activists have made. And she says that comment about the plan is making me think about my experience of mutual aid here. There's so much goodwill, but it's very chaotic as it's being invented on the hoof. My neighbourhood is fairly upper working class, middle class, and there are plenty of people working from home and able to use their cars to pick up shopping for vulnerable neighbours. But I bet there are other communities totally left out. The St Anne's Food Bank has seen demand increase 5-fold already. Meanwhile, we have people raising money for the NHS like a charity in the 6th richest country in the world, which I think is a very good summation of the problem. So I think that is it. We've come to the end of the comments and questions. I'll just have another quick look on Facebook and YouTube to see if we've had anything else. Okay, so that seems to have exhausted our questions and comments. I would like to invite people to have a quick, see if there's anything last you want to say. While you think about that, I'll hand back to our two speakers for some closing remarks. So Scott, maybe you'd like to go first.
Yeah, so I think it needs to be emphasised again and again and again. Mass movement and organisation. That's how things get done. It's, just thinking like some of the policies that Labour put into their manifesto at the end of last year, at the end of the day they were defeated. But it would have been interesting to see how some of these policies would have actually been carried out. Now, in Venezuela, again, to emphasise, Cuba had a revolution. They overthrew a dictatorship. What happened in Venezuela? Now, previously it was Hugo Chavez, who was a former army general who, tried going down the coup road, the coup d'etat road, but failed, was in prison. And then when he got out of prison, it's like, you know what, I'm going to stand for election. And he stood on these platforms and he won, because not only did he say what the mass of population of the country wanted and needed, but he fulfilled those promises. Just like Fidel saying that during a special period we won't close any schools or hospitals. He promised to start using Venezuela as one of the biggest oil-rich countries in the world, although the fact that oil's now traded at less than $0 at the moment is, one of these things that's sabotaged. But at a time when it was needed, he was ready to take that money and spend it in infrastructure that was needed, especially housing. So he said something that sparked a fire among the people and had a lot of people following him. And I would say in this time of the lockdown, if you've got some time, you've got an hour and 15 minutes, look out for a documentary called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised that will show what really happens with, when you look at the most recent failed coup attempt, the Juan Guaido thing. this will show you what's really happening behind the scenes. But when they had arrested Chavez in 2002 and locked him up, it was because the population that voted him in went out onto the streets and said, we want our president back. That, there would have been revolt otherwise. So, and the mass movement, to think back to, go back to the beginning of my talk and the rent strikes in Glasgow. Now, to think about it, these women of all ages, their sons and their husbands are all fighting in war. No one was there to kind of teach them how to chair a meeting or how to take minutes. We have that experience that we can now share, but they had to teach themselves that themselves because they realised it was the most effective way of getting anything done. And there was a lot of people who had never spoke, like the Focus E15 mothers, a lot of them had never spoke to people in their, publicly spoke in their life. They had to learn that. But through learning to do that themselves, that's what we need to be doing, rather than trusting some bourgeois politician on a 75,000 a year salary to say, "Oh, no, elect us and we'll get it sorted once we're in power," But you're passing the same cuts that the other party does. But we need that for a stable government. No, you don't. What you need to do is start listening to the population. We're the people that got you there, and we could take you away from power. So, mass mobilisation.
Thank you very much, Scott. Matt, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Yeah, a few quick comments. So, I think it's brought out in what was just being said about the presidency of Comandante Hugo Chavez. The role of leadership is very important in revolutionary movements. The imperialists killed Patrice Lumumba for a reason. They killed Thomas Sankara for a reason. They tried to kill Fidel Castro. I've seen very large numbers for how many times they tried to do that. I don't know what the true number is, but they tried to kill him many times. But as was just demonstrated with the anecdote about Chavez, without the organized working class behind a revolutionary leader, they can never achieve anything. And the example of Karl Marx is very central in this. He didn't just. People have this idea that he just spent his whole life, hunched over a desk in the British Library writing a book, which is not true. He was one of the leading people in what was called the First International, which was one of the it was one of the biggest steps forwards in the organized working class's history, and that is the sort of organization that we need to be striving forwards. As hopefully my talk and our discussion demonstrated, the reason why people are homeless and in inadequate housing is not some act of God. It's not something natural. There's plenty of materials to make bricks. We have access to energy, heat, metals, materials, wood, etc. We have access to land. The only reason why people are in inadequate housing is because of the social relations between people. We have bailiffs, we have police who are willing to turf people out as soon as the law tells them to. And who does that law act in the interests of? In countries like Britain, it acts in the interests of, your BlackRock, your Serco, your G4S, your HSBC, your Barclays, all these various parasites, warmongers, profiteers of all shades, whose interests are totally in contradiction to the mass of people in Britain and to the mass of the people all over the world. But this is all relationships between people, so it's our job to build other sorts of relationships to try and overturn that system.
Thank you very much, Matt. So I've had a suggestion before we finish about people contributing announcements of things like events before we finish. So I will do that. So we've had one comment from Despine, who says that Youth Strike for Climate Nottingham have an online discussion happening on Tuesday at 4 p.m. on what is capitalism and why should environmentalists care, which is sure to be an interesting discussion. So if you're available, then absolutely come along, says Despine. We haven't had any other announcements, but I do certainly recommend that people do that. Matt?
I don't want to steal your thunder, but we will be having another public meeting, sorry. It's going to be a slightly different format to these ones, but we're going to be discussing Cuba and coronavirus and related stuff. That's going to be on the 5th, Tuesday the 5th, which is coming up soon. We haven't got the, we haven't finalized all of the details, but if you watch our Facebook and if you subscribe to our mailing list, you'll be able to get all the details for that. I'll put a link to subscribe to our mailing list now. And another thing is we've recently launched a fundraiser called Steps Towards Socialism. And if you'd like to support our work, the work of the branch of the Revolutionary Communist Group, please have a look at that link.
Thank you very much, Matt. Yes, and I would reiterate before we go the comments I made earlier about making sure to get yourself a PDF copy of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, where this much needed socialist analysis is put forward. And just before we round up, I would like to end on a political note, and I'd like to quote one of our commenters, Lee, again. I've already quoted him, but hopelessness is definitely our worst enemy, said Lee earlier in the discussion. And I think that's a very fitting end to this meeting. Things are deteriorating for working class people, oppressed nations all around the world. And that is a fact of what is being produced by the capitalist system, by the imperialist system. But the worst thing that we could possibly do is to be hopeless. And as Scott and Matt have both made very clear, the best thing we could possibly do is to fight back. So if our viewers out there, listeners out there, whatever you're doing, if you are interested in being part of that, then please do get in touch through our various ways of contacting us, which you will have access to because you're watching this on either YouTube or